Another thing I would suggest to create jobs in Michigan and in America, energy exploration, or to put it simply, drill baby drill. There is an estimated 1 trillion barrels of oil in the United States of America, either in the form of oil or in the form of shale oil rock, which you have to frack to get it out of the rock. So drill and frack, baby, frack. And if we did both of those, not only, I mean, imagine being able to tell Saudi Arabia to go pound their ample supply of sand and be independent. And in the process, according to Penn State University, we would create 800,000 oil and gas jobs in the United States of America.
Good pay.
And a lot of those good paying jobs, and if you watched in the media here in the last 2 or 3 weeks, this fracking issue was an issue here in Michigan. Because we've got some of that oil shale, which means some of those 800,000 jobs would come here to Michigan. Also, to create jobs, we need to cut taxes even more now. I'm talking about the inheritance tax. You know, the inheritance tax went away through most of the first decade of this century, but it came back last Christmas when they did that extension of the Bush tax cuts. One of Obama's demands was that the inheritance tax come back. What does that do? It makes people who are older, instead of investing in creation of new jobs, hoard their money so that they die, they can leave it to their kids who can pay the federal inheritance tax and not have to sell off their business. So they don't invest it in creating jobs. Same thing with the capital gains tax. If you got to pay capital gains on any gains you make, you don't invest as much as you would otherwise. The corporate income tax in this country is about double the international average of the other countries around the world. So there is an estimated $1 trillion in Swiss bank accounts in the Cayman Islands that American companies have made in other countries, and they won't bring it back on shore because they don't want to right on the spot write a 1/3 of that amount check to the federal government. If we lowered the corporate income tax, then that money could come back on shore and could be invested in the creation of American jobs. This country's got it backwards. There's not a lot of rocket science involved in this. I mean, your elementary school kid could explain it to you. Whatever the federal government subsidizes, we get more of, like unemployment and poverty. What the federal government taxes, we get less of, like productivity and investment. We need to reverse those priorities if we want to create jobs in this country. And I'm one of those who would, like Governor Huckabee has done, support a fair or flat tax so that we are no longer taxed at all on our income. And to make sure, you need to make that go off every time I give one of those applause ones so that you'll know. We ought to repeal the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, so there's never any chance of us having the new tax and that come back at some point in the future. There's all kinds of benefits to a flat tax, but one that I like the best, which I consider, and if you're my age or any older, you know what I'm talking about, being like the Berlin Wall coming down, would be if we could padlock the Internal Revenue Service and make April 15th just another somewhat warm spring day here in Michigan. Padlock the IRS, and in the process we'd get rid of those extra, 15,000 people Obama's hiring to enforce Obamacare.
I'll call you back.
Here's another issue on which I'm not talking theory. I was a county commissioner back in the 90s, and I authored the nation's first medical savings account health care plan for county employees in the nation. I was invited to testify before Congress along with the mayor of Jersey City because he was the first city. And the chief policy advisor of the House Civil Service Committee said in the newspaper that they considered me a national pioneer in health care reform 16 years ago. Dick Morris, in his new book, Revolt, in the chapter about health care reform, says the solution to Medicare funding in the future is medical savings accounts. The same thing I authored 16 years ago, ran around the country talking about, was featured in the United States Senate Finance Committee's press conference, etc., etc. And here that concept is in a nutshell, folks. Instead of giving every Medicare recipient a blank check and tell them you go to the doctor as many times you want, whether you need it or not, and we'll pay for it. This is all alarming stuff. And instead of that, give every Medicare recipient a medical savings account with a lump sum of money in it and tell them whatever you don't spend, you get to keep. And go to Mexico or go buy a new car. People won't be going to the doctor if they don't need to. And my family's had since the 90s a medical savings account. I believe in practicing what I preach. We had a medical savings account. When it's time to go to the doctor, my wife or I call up doctors and we ask them, what do they charge? And we shop around based on price. And if one makes us wait 45 minutes in the waiting room and the other 5, we're likely to go to the one that only makes us wait 5. The price and the quality of service. We would suddenly consume health care just like we do every other product. But how do we consume it now? Like this. Imagine at the grocery store if you had a $100 deductible toward food insurance. As soon as you get through that $100 deductible, the food is free. So you're going to get through that $100 as quick as you can to get to the free food, right? And when the guy who owns the grocery store knows that after that you don't care what he charges for a loaf of bread, because at most you might have to pay a 20% copay on every dollar, what happens to the price of bread? If you don't care what it costs, they'll charge whatever they can get by with. Imagine having a system in which when you go into the waiting room, the doctors have up on the board or on their yellow page ads what they charge for a checkup or various procedures, a guarantee of how long you'll have to wait, because they want to compete for your business because you are a cost-conscious, service-conscious consumer just like you are for every other commodity and service you purchase in the marketplace. You put every federal employee of the United States government on an MSA. You arrange Medicare so that every Medicare recipient is on an MSA. You arrange tax policy so that employers are incentivized to give their employees an MSA, and it's good for the employees to get one, and you will radically transform the healthcare services market in this country. Now, just like on right to work, where Debbie Stabenow is on the other side of that issue, Debbie Stabenow couldn't be more opposite where I stand as a pioneer of free market healthcare reform. She voted for that abortion funding, budget busting, doctor shortaging, freedom destroying, jobs destroying, healthcare rationing Obamacare, the socialization of American medicine. I think we ought to pull the plug, flatline it, drive a stake through its heart. I'd certainly be a vote to repeal it. And one final issue on which I have a record of leadership and action, again not talking theory. I've been president of the American Family Association of Michigan for the last 12 years. We're an advocacy group for traditional Judeo-Christian values in the public policy arena. And probably the thing for which I'm best known in that capacity was I'm one of 2 co-authors of the Marriage Protection Amendment that was on the ballot in 2004. That got 64% of the vote here in Antrim County. Got roughly 60% statewide, saying that marriage shall remain only between a man and a woman. And of course, Debbie Stabenow is on the opposite side of that, endorses so-called homosexual marriage. We'll have all of those homosexual activist PACs sending her money from New York City and from Hollywood. But that's an issue on which I would take it straight to her. That issue passed in Detroit. It got a majority in Flint and Saginaw. I spoke in African American churches when that was on the ballot. And I don't give a boring white guy talk when I speak in African American churches. So based on pre-existing relationships, I'd argue that as a Republican nominee, I could go into places and get votes that no other Republican nominee could. I'm not telling you I can win Detroit. That'd be ridiculous. But just like George W. Bush did in Ohio in 2004, where he got 16% of the black vote instead of the 7 or 8 he got all around the rest of the country because there was a marriage protection amendment on the ballot, I think I could go get 15% of the African American vote. Based on that issue and another issue that I did previously, I was recruited to come to Michigan by the Mackinac Center for Public Policy to promote their universal tuition tax credit in the late 90s, to give any corporation or individual a tax break off their state taxes if they wrote a scholarship check to any individual child, their own child, somebody else's child. A church could have a scholarship fund. This Republican Party could have a scholarship fund. And anything and everything owed in state taxes could be counted against it and reduced as a result. Not only did 72% of all Republican state and federal candidates answer a candidate survey in favor of that, but the president of the largest African-American religious denomination in the state of Michigan endorsed it. And I went to the National Baptist Convention of America convention down in New Orleans, and their president, one of the biggest black religious denominations nationally, endorsed it. So both on the school choice issue and the marriage protection issue, African Americans are more with us on the whole marriage protection issue than the population at large. Those are issues on which I have a record of leadership, of action, not just theory, and on which I could win votes that I don't think the traditional Republican candidate for the United States Senate could. Let me brag a minute on something I read here in your Antrim County Republican newsletter that Tom wrote, because I was going to say it even if I didn't read that Tom had already said it. But as I'm talking to groups around the state, folks, people are mad. And they're not just mad at Obama and the Democrats. They're mad at both parties. Because what are we hearing right now about this debt ceiling deal? The Democrats are whining about how much spending they were forced to cut. And you hear Republicans bragging about how much spending they forced Democrats to cut. And there's no cut in sight. The only thing they did was take us from an increase like this that was going to put us $10 trillion more in debt in 10 years to a very small reduction in the increase that will only leave us $7 trillion more in debt in 10 years. Nowhere outside of that 20-mile radius inside the Beltway of Washington, D.C. does that qualify as a cut to spend us $7 trillion more into the hole. And yet even some of our Republicans talk about how this deal cut spending. Exactly. Einstein said that the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Is it rational to believe that we are going to send back to Washington either a Democrat who's been there for 14 years or a Republican who's been there for 18 years, who voted time after time to increase these debt ceilings to put us in the $1 trillion hole that we're in, and then expect we're going to change the financial insanity in Washington? Is that rational? I don't think it is. I don't think it is rational. Let me close here by reminding you, if you heard him say it the first time around, if you're younger enough to have heard him say it, you might get a kick out of it, what Ronald Reagan said. Way back in 1980, let me update it. We're in the middle of a recession. And a recession is when your neighbor has lost his job. It becomes a depression if you or a member of your family lose your job. And it becomes a recovery when Barack Obama and Debbie Stabenow lose their job. Yeah. Now, what do I think the future of this country is? It's something I want to fight for my children's sake. You know, for Harrison, Hunter, Reagan, and Thomas Jefferson. I want to be bipartisan there at the end. Thomas Jefferson, who goes by Jefferson, and my oldest son's daughter, Sophia. What do I want to fight for? What kind of future? All I tell you is, folks, is human nature doesn't change. It's the same as it's always been. The way we react to freedom and opportunity and incentive as human beings is the same as it's always been. And the way we react to oppression and restriction and taxation and regulation, that's going to stay the same way that it's always been. If we will restore the moral foundation and the founding principles on which this country was founded, then we will not descend into that 1,000 years of darkness that Ronald Reagan warned about. And instead, we can turn the light of productivity and a bright future back on in this shining city on a hill. And that's the mission that is before us. And with that mission before us, I say God bless, heal, preserve, and protect the United States of America. And thank you very much. I'd appreciate your vote.